with last week. What other information do you need to formulate a Quranic perspective? And what are the critical questions that need to be answered to formulate a complete perspective? I hope you took a little bit of time to think about it and also to research about it. One thing that Allama Tabatabayan Shahid Mutahari, amongst other scholars, were known for is they were known to study the material and to think about it even before they came into class. And that really helped them to understand the material when it was being taught. Now, before I go and review the discussion that we had last week, I just want to answer a question that was posed last week. In our discussions, I pointed out that the Quran itself is neither a book of history, nor is it a book of science. It does mention some historical information and some scientific information, but it only uses that to explain some of the doctrines of our faith and some of the ethics of our faith. And I said last week very clearly that, look, the Quran teaches us three things. It teaches us the beliefs of our faith, aqa'id, the ethics of our faith, akhlaq, and the laws of our faith, which are the ahkam. One of the brothers or sisters asked a very important question. They said, is that true that the Quran does not teach science, or the Quran does not teach, for example, history? And it's a very important question because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself says in the Quran that we have revealed this book. The expression is tibyan li kulli shay. Tibyan meaning an explanation, li kulli shay meaning an explanation for everything. So shouldn't we expect everything to? I was looking at the seer of Ayatollah Nasser Makarim Shirazi. I'd seen it before. I just put some of the points for you up on that slide. I'm going to read out what he says about this particular verse, and I just want you to look at the points that are there in the slides. So he says that, look, the word tibyan that's used in this verse, it has the meaning of an explanation. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word li kulli shay, for everything without condition. Therefore, the Quran is an explanation for everything, undoubtedly. Then he says, however, we have to note the fact that the Quran is primarily a book for training and developing humans and human beings. And it has been revealed to perfect the individual and the society in their earthly and spiritual realms. Then he says it becomes clear that the term everything is in reference to all the instructions and all the guidance that a human being needs to be able to traverse this path of success in the world and in the hereafter. He continues and further clarifies, it does not imply, and I'm just reading for you the translation now, that the Quran is a large encyclopedia that contains all the details of mathematics and geography and chemistry and physics and biology, among other sciences. Of course, the Quran itself has issued a general call towards acquiring knowledge in these sciences. He also mentions further that, look, in the Quran, it does unveil some of the secrets of nature where necessary according to the discussion that it's having. However, despite this fact, he says the main purpose and objective of the revelation of the Quran is the development of human beings, right? Developing their iman, developing their akhlaq, developing their practices as well. And with this respect, the Quran has not left aside any guidance. And then I just wanted to clarify that let's look at the Quran as a book of guidance that sometimes makes use of history and science, but let's not look at it as a book of science or a book of history. Okay, coming to the review from last week, one of the first and most important points I made is that it's very important for us to understand the issue itself and the subject that we're discussing, which is evolution, before we start to predicate the Islamic perspective of it. I think one reason why we fail to develop a proper Islamic response to it is because we've not understood evolution to begin with. And therefore, I divided evolution into microevolution and macroevolution. We looked in some detail at microevolution, and we said microevolution is how hereditary traits are passed from one generation to another generation within a population, and there were ways of how, they were passed. They're passed through DNA. There is some mutation within the DNA. There is some migration that happens as well. And also when there's reproduction, there are new, traits which are created. We talked about later on we talked about natural selection as well. And then we also spoke about macroevolution, because as far as microevolution goes, I don't think from an Islamic or Quranic perspective there are many issues for it. But as far as macroevolution goes, macroevolution is this idea that species that we see today in all their diversity and all their life forms. I think that's where the issue is. But then we say, okay, we say there is an issue, but can you explain what is the issue? And the second important point I made last week is that it's very important for us to understand and clarify what are the critical questions when we want to understand the Islamic critical questions. What is important is that you should be able to articulate those questions. And so we articulated them as Shahid Mutahari had articulated them. And we say there are two questions that we want to answer. First, does the theory of evolution negate the existence of God? And two, does the theory of evolution of human beings in particular now contradict the scriptural narration of the genesis of man? And the important point I made last week was to say we're going to discuss these questions separately from each other, mutually exclusive from each other. So in answering question number one, we may even come and say that the evolution of Prophet Adam, for example, does not negate the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's a very valid statement to say. Of course, you will come back and say, well, what about the scriptural narration of the creation of Prophet Adam? And I'll say, well, over there, I might come and say that this is problematic. But when I'm dealing with the first question, even if somebody were to prove that every human being, including Prophet Adam, evolved, it would still not negate the existence of God, possibly speaking. So that's how we made the distinction between the two questions. Now, very important points that I want to make for this week. I'm going to move with an assumption. Now, two ways of tackling this. One is for us to come and say that the theory of evolution is still a theory. And I think it's a theory because some of the mechanisms within evolution have not been worked out. But I think as far as scientists themselves are concerned, they don't see it as a theory. They see it as, something that's close to a law now. And we can come and question it. And if we want to question it, we can do it on scientific basis. There are some scholars who have done that to some extent. Perhaps Harun Yahya has been able to do that. But when we want to question evolution, we question from a scientific perspective, not from being proven if, and that's the assumption that I want to make today, if it has been proven that the theory of evolution, as they talk about it, is valid, then as Allama Tabatabai points out in one of his other texts when he talks about the relationship between philosophy and physics, for example, and the natural sciences, he says if it has been proven in the natural sciences, as philosophers we can do nothing, as theologians we can do nothing, but accept it as a premise and work with that premise. So what I want to do today is I want to make the assumption that the theory of evolution is valid. And let's see what are the consequences of it, that's all what we want to do today. You could always come back and say, I don't agree with the theory of evolution, and then that's fine from a scientific perspective. I just want to see its consequences from a theological and a Quranic perspective. Now, moving on, we're just going to wrap up the review right now. We demarcated the subject of the natural sciences and theology or philosophy. We said one of the reasons why you've got conflict between science and religion sometimes is because the scope and the jurisdiction of the natural sciences and that of religious philosophy and theology has not been separated from each other. When we're talking about the natural processes by which things come into existence, that falls under the realm of the natural sciences. Theology should not come and dabble into that. And then we say that when we're talking about the relationship between these natural phenomena and the natural processes and a metaphysical and a metanatural reality, this philosophy and theology does not fall under the realm of the natural sciences. As long as these two are separated from each other, I don't think you'll find a conflict between religion and science. So we said, assuming the theory of evolution is correct, as scientists have pointed out, the question, does it negate the existence of God? And we say, by no means negate the existence of God. Muslim philosophers have explained that God works based on a system of cause and effect, sabab and asbab. He is the musabbib, he is the cause, but that doesn't mean that things in nature don't have causality, don't facilitate things happening. For example, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to create a human being, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not bring him instantly into existence. He brings them into being through a process, through certain causes. He brings them into existence, and not just human beings. You think of mountains, you think of planets, you think of stars, you think of trees. All of these come into being through a natural process. That's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does things. Question, what about the diversity of species that we see today? These diverse species, how did they come about to be? If we look at the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we need to have a little bit of patience, inshallah, we'll come to that. When we look at species in general, one would say that if we look at the practice and the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who brings things into being through a process, naturally, through causality, and through a means, they would assume that even the various species that we have, God would have brought them into existence through evolution and not just instantaneously. In any case, we say that even the Quran, it will associate a natural phenomena or a natural effect to its natural cause, and at the same time associate it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For example, when it rains, we can explain it from a very geological perspective and a meteorological perspective, and at the same time the Quran will say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it rain. These two causes are not in conflict with each other, they have a vertical relationship with each other. Allah gives causality to the world of nature, the world of nature is able to make things happen. Similarly, if a person were to say God has given causality to the world of nature to bring about all the species that we see, then that's fine. It does not negate the existence of God. Therefore, the first question was rather an easy question for us to answer, which brings us now to the second question. And in the second question, we're dealing in particular with the creation of Prophet Adam, 1, and 2, we're dealing with it not from the perspective that God is the creator, because even if you were to believe that Prophet Adam evolved, that you could also at the same time believe that God made it happen. No, from the perspective of the Quran. The Quran has a particular narration for the creation of Prophet Adam and other human beings, and it seems that anthropologists and paleontologists are giving us a bit of a different narration. So how are we going to deal with that? Before we do that, we're going to use the same process once again. We'll start by looking at human evolution in some detail. Having done that, we're going to start asking what are the critical questions where you find that this theory of human evolution conflicts with the Quran, and then we'll answer those critical questions. So let me start first, inshallah, with human evolution and the Quran. Well, evolutionists extend microevolution to include human beings as well. And they provide the following timeline for human evolution. I'm just looking at it right now from a biological perspective. So if you remember 35 million years ago, the dinosaurs go extinct. Only lemurs and very small monkey-like animals survive. According to evolutionists, they evolved later into monkeys and gorillas and other apes. And then about 6 million years ago, you've got signs of partial bipedalism. You've got these apes who are no longer just walking on fours, they're also sometimes walking on twos as well. And this particular species was known as Sahelanthropus. What's more important is 3.8 million years ago, you've got now, you've got skeletons that show signs of full bipedalism. And this comes from the skeleton Lucy. Some of you might have heard of that excavation, that find of Lucy. And this particular species was known as Australopithecus afarensis. And again, they, by that time, were still based in Africa. Most species at that time that were human-like or close to becoming human-like, you get more of a human-like frame. What I mean by that is that the legs are longer, the hands are longer, and the body itself is smaller, and the torso is becoming a little longer as well, which is very different from what you see in other apes. And the first species to demonstrate that was Homo erectus. In fact, this species has outlived a lot of species in the sense that, Homo sapiens, we'll see, have a lifeline so far of 200,000 years. The Homo erectus had a lifetime of 1.8 million years. I mean, they were alive until, 200,000, 150,000 years ago. But at 600,000 years ago, something more significant happens, and you've got a larger brain to body ratio. So not just a larger brain. Some animals may have a larger brain that we have. No, we're talking about a larger brain to body ratio. And the Homo heidelbergensis, who I believe were in West and North Africa, started to demonstrate that. And therefore, you find these are the first species that actually start to build shelters for themselves, or there are signs that they were building shelters for themselves. And these are also the first species that start using hand axes and other types of tools as well. 200,000 years ago, you've got humans that have, some brain activity very similar to humans today. They may have had the ability to speak and to create language. They have the ability to make very diverse spears, sophisticated spears. They start to socialize, and these are the Homo neanderthalis, and they were based in Europe mostly and in the Middle East. And then finally, 200,000 years ago, you've got Homo sapiens. Now, this doesn't mean that, for example, the Homo sapiens are necessarily, or the Homo erectus are the ancestors of the Homo sapiens, and the heidelbergensis are the ancestors of the Homo sapiens. They're still not sure as to what the relationship between these 3 to 4 or 5 different species are. But this is the timeline that they appear in. And there was a time on the face of this earth that you had at least 3 to 4 different human-like species, living on the earth. But I pointed out to you last week, it's not just a biological evolution that's important to us. In fact, more important to us, and you'll see today, is the social, technological, and geographical evolution. So let's look at that today. So as the brain-to-body ratio increased, there was a gradual technological and social progress as well. About 2.6 million years ago, the Stone Age begins, and you find that human beings are starting to carve stones into different tools that they use for hunting. They put these stones up the spear. This will be emailed to you, inshallah. I'm sorry about that, but inshallah, that will be available on the website. Not only that, but now they're taking small stones, they're carving these stones, spending a lot of time on them, and not only making them unique, so that they're able to cut into animals, they're able to cut out animals that they have caught, able to cut the grass and cut their food as well. And then 800,000 years ago, something very, very important happens. Human beings are able to control fire. And I can't emphasize how important that is. The ability to control fire allowed, according to evolutionists, human beings to go into areas that they usually would not have been able to go into because it was too cold. Not only that, but this is more important. Human beings, before they weren't human beings really, they were species, but these species were eating a lot of grass, they were eating a lot of vegetation, and they were spending about 8 to 10 hours in the day eating all of this because they needed all this nutrition. They're not able to eat as much meat at that time. The ability to control fire now allows them to eat meat that gives them a lot more protein, allows the body to digest the meat much easier, so you don't need such a very intricate digestive system to be able to eat the meat. And more importantly, now they've got more time on their hands, and they don't have to spend the whole day eating grass or vegetation. Not only that, but in the evenings they can sit around the fire, they can communicate with each other, and they can share ideas with each other. And therefore we find that because of that, the body, the mind size increases as well. And 600,000 years ago, the Homo heidelbergensis, they start building shelters. Interestingly, 100,000 years ago, human beings start burying the dead. We've got some of the earliest examples of that, making simple jewelry. One of the areas that you want to look at is Jabal Qafza. Just Google it. You'll find some information about it on Wikipedia. What was very interesting about this find, which comes from 100,000 or 90,000 years ago in present-day Palestine, in 2 places, Jabal Qafza and also in school, what they found is that the people who were buried there, They had symbolic writings upon them with red ochre, and they were buried with some of their ornaments and some of their tools as well. So it would seem that the belief in the hereafter, or some form of belief in the hereafter, had started to develop by that time. And 12,000 years ago, human beings turned from being hunters and gatherers into becoming farmers and settling down really, and which was very important for human development. Other things that should have come on there that haven't come on there would be interesting for you to look into is how did clothing develop within human evolution? When did human beings start to wear clothes and how much were they covering themselves? And the other area would also be the evolution of language itself as well. When we start talking about it from a Quranic perspective, you'll just see why that is so important. Lastly, human geographical evolution, and that is very, very small for you to be able to see. But if you're able to squint and see, I'll just point out some of the things for you. So I think you can see where Africa is, and there's a number there, 100,000. That means that human beings, Homo sapiens, up to 100,000 years ago, were in Africa. 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens appear in southern tip of Africa. From there, they're starting to migrate northwards. Every year, they're migrating a little more and more northwards. Finally, around 100,000 years ago, they leave Africa. And once they leave Africa, then their paths divide and they go to different parts of the world. You may be thinking right now, why are we talking about this? Towards the end of today's lecture, I'll come back with a very important question, and really you'll see why this is important. So they leave Africa and they go to different parts of the world. By 30 to 40,000 years ago, they've made it to India and China, and also 40,000 years ago, they made it to Europe, as you can see, especially the Neanderthals, but the Homo sapiens have started to enter Europe. And once the Neanderthals went extinct, those Homo sapiens were, getting there. They get into around 40,000, 35,000 years ago. And some of them have gone north here. Can somebody hear me? Yes, okay, good. Alhamdulillah. Are you able to hear me? Or is it breaking up? Breaking up. Okay. For some of you, it's breaking up. For some of you, it's okay. Okay. Breaks up occasionally. All right. Maybe that's a good break. Okay, let's continue, inshallah, and see. If it's still breaking up, let the tech support know, and then maybe I can try to move my location and hopefully. Okay, alhamdulillah, I hope it's good. All right, so we start moving out into the Bering Strait, and we come across to North America around 35,000 years ago, and slowly we inch our way southwards to South America, so around 12,000 years ago. Now, I know one of the questions you must have is, we didn't have a calendar back then. How do they know that this is when human beings reached these parts of the world? So, they've done excavations, they found human fossils, and they study human fossils both in paleontology and in anthropology, and they have a special way of dating these fossils. So up until 40,000, 50,000 years ago, they used carbon 14 dating. That there are certain unstable elements that have a decay process, and they have a particular rate of decay. There are certain isotopes which will decay. So, they will look at the rate of decay, they'll look at what we have, and they'll tell you how old this particular fossil is. In cases above 40,000, they use uranium-235 or potassium-40, I believe, or potassium-140 to date these particular fossils. But, the process that they use seems to be, an okay process and gives us at least a general idea of when human beings moved out into these areas. Now, you understand what we're talking about when we talk about human evolution, according to science. Before I come into the critical questions, can you just help me out over here and tell me, when we come to the Quran and the Quran itself, and nothing else, the Quran, when we look at the Quran itself, what can you tell about the beginnings of human beings from the Quran? Just share with me, one point that you know. I'll give you an example. It seems our understanding from the Quran is that human beings began with Prophet Adam and Lady Hawa. That's one point. Point number two, what else do you know about the beginnings of human beings from the Quran? They were created from dust or from the earth, from teen or turab. Good. Another point, they were exiled from the Garden of Paradise, and there's a discussion there whether this paradise was, away from the earth or was it on the earth itself. Seems many commentators now gravitate to the fact that it was on earth itself. They were created for ibadah. Okay, that's from a very ethical and doctrinal perspective. No, from a very historical perspective. The intellect, okay, good. We're also assuming, because that's a very important point, the Quran doesn't seem to mention directly other human beings who lived at the time of Prophet Adam. So we're assuming that this is the beginning of all human, Homo sapiens, for example. They disobeyed Allah's orders. Again, that's from a very ethical and doctrinal perspective. From a historical perspective, what else can you say about Prophet Adam and Lady Hawa? Okay, so when we look at it, we can say that, look, our current understanding from the Quran is as follows. The first human beings were Prophet Adam alayhi salam and Lady Hawa. They were created from clay, from turab or tin, instantaneously by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Interestingly, the Quran provides no time frame for when Prophet Adam came onto the earth. But of course, the Quran doesn't provide a time frame or a time for even Prophet Nuh or Prophet Ibrahim. It seems such details are not important for the Quran. But I just want to ask you a question. Keep it in mind. I'll come back to and ask you this question again. If you had to guess, and you had to give your best guess, when would you say that Prophet Adam, the one who's mentioned in the Quran, that prophet of God, when would you say that that prophet of God lived on this earth? When did he come to this earth? Give me a very ballpark figure. Okay, not right now. Just think about it. Direct mention of other humans before Adam, and emphasis on no direct mention of other human beings. All human beings are considered to be the children of Adam alayhi salam. The Quran refers to us as Bani Adam. And the Quran doesn't refer to him, but, a lot of scholars will refer to him as Abul Bashar, the father of, humanity. And also another interesting point is Qabil was the first human to bury another human being, or so it seems from the Quran. Other pieces of interesting information from Hadith is that, Habil and Qabil were farmers. Okay, now you see why that discussion seems to be important. That they were able to have language. They spoke very clearly to each other. At least it would seem from the Quran. They spoke very, very, clearly to each other, and that they had clothes. Now you're starting to see why that discussion becomes important. It's not just about biology. Actually, the discussion is more about social, cultural, linguistic, and technological progress according to Quran and science. All right, so if this is what we have from the Quran, and that is what we heard about human evolution. Now let me ask you, what are some of the critical questions that you would ask over here? What are some areas of conflict between our current understanding of the Quran and the understanding given to us by the natural sciences? And I want to bring it down to three particular questions. What would you say are the questions? Okay, good. Were Prophet Adam and Lady Hawa the only human beings at that time? Are there no other human beings at that time or before them? If they were, how come they have not been mentioned in the Quran? Thank you, Sister Sarah. That is going to be one of my questions. Second question. Okay, were they the first human beings possessing intellect? Okay, yeah, that's also an important question that we need to ask. Maybe there were other human beings before them possessing intellect as well. But I'm going to formulate that question a little differently. There is no mention of evolution. So how would you formulate that question? Okay, only two sons. How were Bani Adam generated? No, that is a question that comes up for me. That's not a particularly very, very, very important question, because in the hadith it is answered, either by saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent some people for them to be able to marry, or they were allowed to have certain forms of marriages which perhaps may not be, permissible in this day and age, but in some ways it was resolved. It's not a big issue. They were sent on the earth with the ability to communicate. Okay, where does Nabi Adam fit in according to the when we talked about Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalis, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo florensis, where does Prophet Adam fit in there? All right, here are the three questions I want to answer today. Number one, does the Quran mention the existence of other human-like species? If not, is this a deficiency or an oversight on the part of the Quran? Second question, was Prophet Adam alayhi salam created instantaneously through a miracle of God, as it would seem from the apparent meaning of the Quran, or did he come into being through a process of macroevolution? In other words, did Prophet Adam have a mother and a father, or did he not have a mother and a father, right? Because somebody could say, well, he had a mother and a father, but he was the first intelligent human being to have that intellectual capacity, and before him, his parents did not have that intellectual capacity, as a claim. If he was created by miracle, as the Quran seems to imply, does this contradict science then? Is this a contradiction between Quran and science? Third question, and this is the most important question, I think, for me anyways, are all human beings the children of Prophet Adam? Okay, so, let me ask you a question over here. I had asked you, when do you think Prophet Adam lived on this earth? Your answer was 10,000 years. So, if you say 10,000 years, then by that time, they have people living already in Australia, they have people living already in South America. You would have to agree that those people are no longer the descendants of Prophet Adam alayhi salam, right? You'd have to agree that they are descendants of, human beings who came before Prophet Adam alayhi salam. And then you can say that Prophet Adam is the biological father of all human beings and the humankind. And coming out of Africa, this all happened before we came out of Africa. But then what that means was that Prophet Adam was in Africa, or at least, close to Africa, or maybe you could say in the Middle East. Secondly, when we look at 120,000 years ago, there is no really, in terms of the things that excavated and the fossils that found, there is no sign of any culture, any sort of society, any sort of law. There is no sign of, proper language. There is no sign of practicing of religion. There is no sign of any sort of advanced thought during that time. Yet when the Quran talks about Prophet Adam, وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ, we taught him the names years ago, all the time. When we talk about when Prophet Nuh came, for example, most of the scholars will tell you, it's about 4,000, maybe 5,000, 6,000 years ago. And you're saying, okay, well then, before Prophet Nuh until Prophet Adam, we've got a whole open area of about 100,000 years. I mean, it's one thing to write a 1,000-year passage, between two or three prophets of God, seems very difficult. And Brother Shabbar, you'll be surprised as to what scientists, what paleontologists and anthropologists can do with just a piece of fossil. They can tell you what that person ate. They can tell you what that person, whether the person ate was, something that was cooked or wasn't cooked. They can tell you what type of life they had, whether they wore clothes or they didn't wear clothes. You'd be very surprised what they can. I want you to think about. All right, moving on. I'm going to be running out of time, I see, but in any case, tools for understanding the Quran. So let me just lay down some basics for us to approach the Quran. And this is something that I just want us to be clear on before we move forward. Some of our scholars say that the Quran is the spoken manifestation and tajalli of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a manifestation, but in the spoken form. The world of creation that we're studying is also a manifestation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but in a created form. I was listening to one of the scholars, Sayyid Kamal al-Haydari. He made a very beautiful point. He said there can never be conflict between the created manifestation of Allah and the spoken manifestation of Allah, between the kalam of Allah and between the khalq of Allah. Then if there is a conflict, it's a conflict between our understanding of the world, which is science, natural sciences, and our understanding of the Quran, which is tafsir of the Quran. If there is a conflict, it is between our understanding of one and the other. It's never between one and the other. And therefore, when we talk about, changing something, we're not talking about changing the Quran. We're talking about changing our understanding of the Quran. Okay, with that made clear, another tool that I want us to keep in mind as we move forward is that, look, there are some verses of the Quran which are known as muhkam. Muhkam meaning firm, meaning that they are not open to interpretation. When you look at them, only one interpretation is accepted by it. For example, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, say Allah is the singular. Say the fact is that Allah is the singular. Over here, there is no doubt with respect to, meaning is singular, but there's a possibility of duality or a possibility of multiple gods. There's absolutely no possibility. The verse is very, very clear about this. But there's some verses of the Quran known as mutashabih. Mutashabih meaning they resemble something, right? And what this means is that what it means is that it's open to interpretation upon first glance. Meaning upon first reading, when you look at it, it's possible that one meaning stands out to you, but it also takes on other meanings as well. It can take on another meaning as well. I'll give you an example right now. For example, when the Quran talks about wajhullah, the face of God, or yadullah, the hand of God, the apparent meaning there is that God has a physical hand and a physical face. But there is also that possibility that here the face is being used and the hand is being used in a metaphorical manner. Such verses of the Quran, when you refer them to the muhkamat, the firm verses of the Quran, then they become clear for you. So for example, you've got verses in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَيْسَ مِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ, there is absolutely nothing like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, if God had a hand, we've got hands, and we become like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, we come to understand over here through this other verse of the Quran that yes, when God talks about his hand, apparently it means the physical hand, but with reference to other verses of the Quran, it's not talking about the physical hand, it's talking about the power of God. The hand is being used in a metaphorical sense. If that is clear, just one point before moving forward is therefore what seems to happen is a verse which is mutashabih, when you read it first, upon consideration, the verse becomes muhkam. And this is Allama Tabatabai's explanation. He implies that it is our understanding that is muhkam and mutashabih, and not the verse inherently itself. I usually do a whole topic or a whole class on this, but I'm just going to quickly give it to you. Now, we will have to see if the verses of the Quran about the creation of Prophet Adam are muhkam or mutashabih. But before we move on, flood of Prophet Nuh, very quickly, was it a global flood or a local flood? Global. One local, two locals, I guess local. Okay, so that's a very interesting question. Now it seems apparently from the Quran that it was a global flood. Allama Tabatabai also, demonstrates this in this tafsir of the Quran that it was a global flood. I mean, you look at the apparent, nature of the verses. I mean, it seems that it was a global flood. But there is a scholar, and he's a very renowned scholar as well. He passed away now, Lahadi Ma'arifat, a student of Sayyid Al-Khou'i, known as a mufassir of the Quran, known as somebody who wrote about tafsir of the Quran. He says, well, we need to reconsider those verses based on other verses of the Quran, 1, 2, based on intellectual arguments, and 3, based on scientific arguments as well, perhaps, that it wasn't a global flood, it was a local flood. Now that's very interesting. Mutashabih doesn't mean that, multiple interpretations, all of them are equally possible. Mutashabih can sometimes mean that one interpretation is apparent But there are other interpretations which may seem far-fetched in the beginning, but when you consider them, they do become more important than the apparent meaning. Ayatollah Hadi, I can later on give you the name of the book in which he did sometime soon. Now, so what I'm trying to point out is when we're looking at this, narration of Prophet Adam in the Quran, some things may be apparent, some meanings may be distant, but upon thinking, they might come closer to us. Okay, moving on. The first question, were there humans before Prophet Adam? If there were, how come the Quran does not mention them, even if you put at the time like 120,000? They were Neanderthals, they're Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis that were there before them. How come the Quran does not mention them? This question is not a very, very important question because the Quran is not a book of history. It only uses relevant and historical events to teach theology and ethics. But, as we pointed out earlier, the Quran has not taken upon itself to explain all of history to us. And those parts of history which were irrelevant or at that time may have been confusing, the Quran would not have spoken about them. But there is indirect mention in the Quran. For example, when God is talking to the angels and he says, "Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa," I'm going to place my vicegerent on this earth. They said, are you going to place someone on the earth who's going to cause bloodshed and spread violence? And the questions our scholars ask is, how did the angels know? And there are different answers to it. Perhaps the angels knew because they knew the nature of man and the nature of the physical world. But another answer entertained in the books of tafsir is because they had seen what the other human beings had done, or perhaps they were seeing what the other human-like species were doing at that time. Secondly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. We have created man in the best of forms. Until 1-2 centuries ago, we would say compared to all other animals that we see, man has the best of forms. But you could come here and argue that compared to other human-like species that came before Prophet Adam and before human beings have the best of forms. And we spoke about how they have the best of forms. There's also some mention about them in hadith as well. There's a hadith which has been, attributed to Imam Ali alayhi salam and Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam as well, wherein both of them imply that before Adam there were many other Adams. The Imam say, do you think that before Adam God did not create other Adams? Do you think that before your world God did not create other worlds? Of course Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did. When the man came and asked the first Imam, tell me, what was there 3,000 years before Adam? And the Imam said, there were human-like species perhaps. There was Adam at that time. And the man asked again. And the Imam kept saying again and again, there was Adam. And even before that, there was Adam, and so on and so forth. There are even some ahadith that talk about human lives in the Quran. You could claim and mention of it definitely in the hadith. And even if there is no mention of it, as I said to you earlier, the Quran is not a book of history. It just takes those sections which are relevant to make ethical and doctrinal points. Moving on to the second question, which is a little more interesting now, is the creation of Prophet Adam. Was it instantaneously from clay as a miracle without a mother and father, or was it created, was he created through a process of evolution? Process of, just as other species evolved, Prophet Adam as well evolved. Well, it seems from the apparent meaning of the Quran that the creation of Prophet Adam was a miraculous creation. Look at these two verses in front of you right now. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about Prophet Adam. Secondly, I can see answers coming there, but let's take it one step at a time. It's a process of learning. And remember when your Lord say to the angels, I'm going to create a human out of a dry clay, from an aging mud. When I have proportioned him, فَإِذَا سَوَّيْتُهُ وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, and I have breathed my spirit into him, فَقَعُوا لَهُ سَاجِدِينَ, then fall in prostration. When you look at this verse, 3 points stand out to you. First, he was created from clay, from turab. 2, he was lifeless when he was being proportioned. There was no life within him. And 3, God gave life to him by placing a ruh that he somehow associates to himself as well, within Prophet Adam. So it would seem that the creation was a miraculous creation. However, some of the commentators of the Quran say, no, this is the apparent meaning. But when you look at other verses of the Quran and you look at the scientific data that we have, we could say that no, the Quran, this is our understanding of the Quran. The Quran itself does not necessitate that Adam be created without a mother or a father. Look at these two verses of the Quran. First, an evidence for macroevolution. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, خَلَقْنَاكُمْ, we created you. It's not talking about Adam, it's talking about you. And then we shaped you. That means that you as a species were created from more simpler species. Now, I know you might be thinking, what am I arguing right now? One of the qualities of a person who is able to understand an issue like Shahid Mutahari was first to be able to argue a point from somebody else's perspective, to understand it fully from that other person's perspective, and then think about whether it's valid or not. So let's just argue it from the other perspective. ثُمَّ صَوَّرْنَاكُمْ, then we gave you shape, meaning that you were being shaped, first, for example, as Homo erectus, and then Homo habilis, and then maybe Homo sapiens came out, shaping you at that time. And then when finally the Homo sapien came about to be, and he had that, and amongst the Homo sapiens, they developed that intellectual capacity. Now it changes from human beings as a whole to talking about Prophet Adam in particular. We said, do sujood to Prophet Adam. Another example for evidence for humans at the time of Adam, and when you look at this verse, it doesn't seem that that is what it's trying to imply, but look at this line of argument. إن الله اصطفى آدم ونوح وآل إبراهيم وآل عمران على العالمين. God chose, Prophet Adam and Nuh, the family of Abraham and the family of Imran above all people. Now, when you say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose Prophet Nuh above all people of his time, of course, there were, let's say, thousands of people, and out of them, Allah chose Prophet Nuh. That is what it means to choose. To choose, you have to have a group of people, and God chooses out of them. Same with the children of Prophet Ibrahim and Prophet Ibrahim. Same with the children of Imran and Prophet Imran himself, right? There were so many people. God chose one of them and said, he's going to be my prophet. If that's the case, and God chose him amongst those people, if that's the case, then those people must have evolved. And therefore, if they evolved, there's nothing wrong with saying Prophet Adam also evolved. That is the argument that, a group of people can make. All right. Now, if we've understood their argument, how do we look at these arguments? Do we accept them? Do we not accept them? What Atla Jawadi Amuli points out is that there are certain verses of the Quran which seem very decisive, and they don't seem to be open to interpretation on this issue. He makes the reference to two examples. The first example is that ayah that appears in Mubahila. إن مثل عيسى عند الله كمثل آدم خلقه من تراب ثم قال له كن فيكون. Surely the example of Isa in the eyes of God is like the example of Adam. God created Adam from clay and said be, and so he was. Because the Christians of Najran had come to the Prophet and said that, look, if Isa doesn't have a father, that means his creation was a miraculous creation. That means God is his father. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responded by saying that this is not something difficult for God. Just as God created Prophet Isa as a miracle, he created Prophet Adam as well as a miracle. Don't you believe in the miraculous creation of Adam? Well, it's easy to understand. The miraculous creation of Jesus and Isa is so easy for you to understand. Or in other words, if God can create a man without a mother and a father, then certainly create a man without a father. Is it breaking up for everybody? No and yes, yes and no. Okay. All right. Maybe for those of you who it's breaking up for you, you can just close some of the other applications have moved to a place which is, closer to your Wi-Fi, to your router. That might help, inshallah. Okay. So, it seems very clear from this particular verse that Prophet Adam's creation is a miraculous creation and not a gradual creation. Another example Ayatollah Amuli points out is to say the burial of Habil by Habil. So if they evolved, then Habil would not have a problem with the burial of Qabil, right? Sorry, Qabil would not have a problem with the burial of Habil. He would just have seen what the people around him were doing. He would just have seen what his ancestors had done, and he would have done the same as well. It seems that he was stumped. He didn't know what to do because at that time, wherever they were living, there were no other human-like species over there, and he had never seen any other. He had not lived in a small clan or a society where he could see what they did with their dead, and therefore he was stumped at what to do. And the Quran says we sent crows, and the crows taught him what to do. Okay, in this case, 2 points are very important. Point number 1, if you were to say that his creation was a miraculous creation, does this contradict science? Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli says, no, it doesn't contradict science. For example, how does a baby come into this world? Science has explained that. However, does it mean that you cannot have a miraculous creation as in the case of Prophet Isa? No, you can have a miraculous creation. Science does not say that miracles cannot happen. Similarly, even if we were to say that the creation of Prophet Adam was a miraculous creation, science cannot say that, well, miracles cannot happen. In the case of Prophet Adam, that's how God decided to create him at that time. So I just have a quote over there from him, from the perspective of humanology, or you could say even, paleontology. The theory of evolution does not negate the account of the Quran. The theory of evolution only notes that human beings can come into existence by a process of evolution. However, the theory of evolution does not claim that the only way for humans to come into existence is through the process of evolution. So, other human-like species could have evolved. There could have been some evolution within human beings or human-like species as well. All we're saying is that it seems from the Quran, Prophet Adam was created as a miracle by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second important point I want to make is, though, if a person comes and says, no, I don't believe that. I believe that Prophet Adam himself, the man referred to in the Quran, was created through a process of evolution as well. Does this person cease believing in God? No, he doesn't cease believing in God. We demonstrated that already. Does it mean this person doesn't believe in the Quran anymore? No, it doesn't mean that this person doesn't believe in the Quran anymore. He's just telling you that my understanding of the Quran is different from your understanding of the Quran, and these are the reasons why I understand these verses differently. Would we disagree with him? We would disagree with him. But if you have somebody like that in your family, does it mean that that person has now become a kafir? Or you have somebody in your friends like that, does it mean that person has become a kafir? No, by no means does he become a kafir. That's a particular view that he has taken, and as long as he's telling you that I believe in God and I believe in the Quran and this is my understanding of the Quran, then that's his understanding now of the Quran. Running out of time, so I'm going to quickly go through the last 2 slides as well. Are we all the children of Adam? Implications. If you say yes, we are all the children of Adam, then we know that Homo sapiens left Africa over 100,000 years ago. This would mean that Prophet Adam lived over 100,000 years ago. Now, in your spare time, you can go and Google Spencer Wells. I believe that's the name, Spencer Wells. He's done some work for the National Geographic, and it's actually really, really interesting. And you can be part of his experiment, but what he has demonstrated is that all human beings actually come from what he calls Y chromosome man, and this is accepted scientific research, that lived over 100,000 years ago. Okay, but if you say that all human beings are the biological children of Prophet Adam alayhi salam, in light of what we said about evolution, you're going to have that Prophet Adam lived over 100,000 years ago. That comes with its own baggage, because now you have to explain, for example, how come there isn't, so much in terms of religious teachings. There aren't that many religious practices. When you talk about Prophet Adam, if you accept for that, his children were hunters, were farmers, how come, they say that farming started 12,000 years ago? If they were to demonstrate that language was not sophisticated 100,000 years ago, and doesn't seem to be sophisticated 100,000 years ago, then how can a prophet of God not have sophisticated language? And the Quran talks about him having very sophisticated language. So it comes with its own baggage that you have to try and resolve. If you say no, we're not all the children of Adam. Some of us are the children of Adam. Some of us evolved, and that's okay. Some of us are Sayyid, they're the children of the Holy Prophet. Some are not Sayyid, not children of the Holy Prophet. Doesn't mean that they're not human beings. They're all human beings, right? And so if you say no, then it allows for the evolution of other human beings through macroevolution. However, it would seem to contradict the apparent meaning of a number of verses in the Quran. For example, the Quran refers to us as Ya Bani Adam, all of us as the children of Adam. There's so many other verses in the Quran which talk about the fact that we come from min zakarin wa unsa, from a man and from a woman, right? Ya ayyuhan nas inna khalaqnakum min zakarin wa unsa, we created from one man and from one woman. Now, that could mean your parents, or it could mean Prophet Adam. So it seems to, go against the apparent meaning of many of the verses in the Quran. It also contradicts the apparent narration of the development of human societies and human technologies. There is no class next week. So there are two possible options over here. If you give me 3 minutes, I will wrap up with that. And this discussion is where it gets really, really interesting. There are two opinions out there, and I'm just going to present those two opinions to you. The question that sometimes we have to ask is the Quranic narrations about historical incidents, are they to be taken literally, or are they to be taken symbolically? There are two opinions out there. There's a literal narration. Atul Nasser Makarim Shirazi rejects the possibility of a symbolic narration. He says, no, the narration is a very literal narration. It's talking about it from a scientific perspective as well. And therefore, by that, Prophet Adam is the biological father of all of humanity in that opinion. But there's another view that says, no, these narrations are symbolic narrations. They're not necessarily literal and, they're not necessarily literal and historical narrations. Ayatollah Murtaza Mutahhari entertains the possibility. I don't want to say that he says that this narration is a symbolic narration, but he entertains the possibility that it may be a symbolic narration. He says it's possible that the Quran is talking about the creation of Prophet Adam in a very symbolic manner. Not to say Prophet Adam is not a real person. No, by all means, Prophet Adam was a real person. He was a prophet of God. He lived at some point in history. But the Quran is just symbolically using this narration in a very symbolic manner, not to talk about it from a historical perspective, but simply to explain some of the ethics, the importance of not being proud, the importance of, for example, not being jealous, the importance of recognizing that we are being created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it is absolutely not looking at it from the perspective of what we would call today paleontology and anthropology. It's purely looking at it from an ethical and doctrinal perspective. The status of human beings is what it is trying to convey. The knowledge of human beings, or the knowledge they can have, is what it is trying to convey, but not necessarily how was Prophet Adam created from a scientific perspective. Not my view, Shaheed Murtaza Mutahhari's view. In this case, if you took that opinion, not his view, sorry, he just entertains that possibility. In this case, if you were to accept that it's a symbolic narration, you could claim that he is the intellectual, Prophet Adam is the intellectual father of humanity, but not necessarily the biological father of all of humanity. That's another implication of it. I'm not going to give you, a particular position on it. These are the two opinions out there right now. More emphasis being put on the first opinion. The second one is still not that, prevalent right now. But the point I want to make over here is not the opinion itself, but the fact that today we came to realize some very important questions. And we would not have come to realize these questions and the importance of these questions if we had not followed the process. The process that we followed was, one, we had what we call ruh ilmi, an epistemic spirit. We said, let us first see what is evolution and what is human evolution even before we talk about it. Secondly, we said, let's look at the verses of the Quran in a very objective manner. For a moment, let's put our previous understandings aside and see what is the Quran open to in particular. And we learned to ask critical questions. What are those questions that I need to be able to answer to get a comprehensive understanding? More importantly, my ability to articulate those questions. Are they clear in my mind? Then we looked at the different opinions that were out there, inshallah. So to sum it up, then, we said that we looked at it from a theological perspective. We said no theological problems with it. We looked at it from a Quranic perspective. We said three questions need to be answered. First question was, were there other human beings during the time of Prophet Adam or before him? It is possible. I showed you some examples of that. Second question, Prophet Adam created through macroevolution or created through a miracle of God? I said, it would seem from the Quran and my understanding of it through an act of miracle of God that doesn't contradict science. However, if somebody wanted to say, no, I think he was created through evolution, I would disagree with him, but that doesn't make him a kafir. And thirdly, are all of us the children of Prophet Adam? And you understood, if you had not looked at geographical evolution, this question would not have been important to you. But now that you look at geographical, social, and technological evolution, this question you answer yes has ramifications, you answer no has ramifications. And we ended up by asking, well, this whole narration of Prophet Adam in the Quran, is it a literal narration or a symbolic narration? Well, we say depending on how you view it, it has different answers for you. Okay, I think I'll stop over here. I've gone 5 minutes above my time limit. The slides will be available online for you to take a look at. The lecture would also be available for you to take a look at online. You can share it with others, inshallah. We still don't know whether it's a literal or symbolical interpretation. I mean, Atlas Makaram Shirazi rejects any type of symbolic interpretation. Shaykh Murtaza Mutahari, he does seem to, actually quite talk about it quite a bit, and it could be a symbolic interpretation, perhaps. Any questions now? If you have no questions, Jazakumullah for joining us. Feel free to leave the class if you have other things to do. I'll end the class with a short dua. اللهم وفقنا لما تحب وترضى ولا تكلنا إلى أنفسنا طرفة عين أبدا. And if you have questions, please, stay behind and you can ask. Salams to you as well. I had sent out my email address last week, and I'm going to put it out again this week as well. If you want to have a more detailed discussion about this, please feel free to email me with some of your thoughts, and I'll try to respond. One of the sisters had done that during the week, and I responded to her in some detail. Feel free to do that. Any reading material on this topic? I have to tell you, I've had to do